Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. This week I thought I'd do something a little bit different and I'd show you something that I do actually quite a lot, and I think it makes quite good use of sort of limited space and sort of limited budget, as it were. Anyway, I thought before I give it a good trim I'd show you this sort of rather chaotic jungle, which is actually my newest tank actually. It's almost exactly a year old to the day, which is, well, by my standards barely mature anyway. It's just ticking along and just getting started. Anyway, this tank is actually a very sort of functional tank really. It was never designed to be a thing of beauty. It's really just a tank that I use and utilise all the time. And for me, it basically has four uses. The first of which is kind of its original setup really, was mainly really as a quarantine tank. And I've always been a great stickler for quarantining fish. I've always felt it was really important, and it goes right the way back to my shop days. I always found that imported fish need a good 2 weeks quarantine to be reasonably sure that they weren't carrying anything sort of untoward that would infect or be a problem in other tanks. And I think in actual fact that the term quarantine is a little bit misleading. I think the sort of more appropriate phrase really is just a settling in period or a settling down period really, just to give the fish a chance to be undisturbed and just sort of generally get used to different water conditions and de-stress after possibly a long journey, and really just get used to the new environment. And you would often find that new fish don't actually feed terribly well and are terribly shy to start with, so they all need that little bit of extra TLC in a nice quiet settled sort of environment. But one thing I've always found in my experience is that fish actually rarely get sick if they're not unduly stressed by the environment or perhaps the tank mates, things that are going on around them. So really the more settled they are, the happier they are. And definitely as far as imported fish are concerned, the first couple of weeks are really critical, just to let them settle down from the stress of the journey, because you can actually quite often get a bit of a delayed reaction, maybe a week after they've been shipped. And if you get one of those really nasty bacterial infections, they're quite difficult to treat, and you really don't want that in your main tank. So it's definitely something I would always recommend doing. Anyway, a tank like this actually for a sort of a home quarantine tank is, I think, actually kind of a perfect way of doing it, because it's a nice settled environment for your fish, and also you're able to just sort of observe things, and if you do need to react or do anything, you can kind of catch things in time. So that's always a best policy really. Anyway, there's sort of what I would call the second use that I'm certainly using this tank for, is actually just to try out a different substrate combination. And I've tried, I'm sure you're aware, well, I kind of call it a million different combinations, but obviously not that many, an awful lot. But there's always another little combination in the back of my mind that I want to try. So setting up a new tank is always a bit of a thrill to get the opportunity to do that kind of thing. But those of you who know me, you know that I like to keep things simple, and this tank is a really good example of that. The substrate in this tank is really just that. It's just 1/2 inch, about 10 millimeters of literally just sieved garden soil, just very finely sieved soil. And this soil is actually then capped with about 3.5 inches, which is about 8 centimeters of just very, very fine play sand. Just the kind you get from a hardware store, nothing fancy. It seems to be inert, so it seems to work perfectly well for aquariums, so I'm quite pleased with that really. But one of the reasons I actually wanted to try this kind of combination was actually when I get around to setting up the 100-gallon beast of a tank that I was showing you a few weeks ago, it's a similar sort of combination to this that I want to use in that tank. So before I did a great big 100-gallon tank, it's always nice to just do a little sort of test run first, just so that you have a good idea of how it might function and how it might settle down. But anyway, I'm quite happy really with the way it's actually settled down. It's come around sort of quite well in actual fact. It's not a thing of beauty, as I say, but it was never designed to be that. But it's good and healthy, it's lovely and clear, all the water parameters are good and everything, so I'm quite happy with that. It did have a few sort of teething problems. For the first 6 months I was plagued by this rather annoying, very thin sort of string algae, which was a bit of a pain, but that was primarily my fault, because shortly after I set the tank up I got a bit sidetracked and I didn't have enough plants in the tank, and they really weren't the right plants to fend off algae, but they were all just really too many slow growing plants anyway. But I've now had the chance to kind of sort that out by poking in a few more fast growing things, and just given that bit of time, it's just sorted itself out quite nicely really. Anyway, it brings me on to what I've described as maybe the third use that I have for this tank at the moment, and that really is just a temporary storage for new plants that I've found along the way. I'm sure you're the same as me. You're out and about in fish shops, or perhaps Googling or looking online, and you come across a new plant, you spot something new, and you kind of can't resist it. So it's always nice to have a tank that you can just sort of poke the extras in, even if you don't have an actual permanent home for them, as it were. But as you can see, this tank is very much just things dotted around you, just poked in the holes, as it were, whenever I get a spare bit of space, which is really just why the tank is a bit of a mess really, but it is just fairly random. And as much as I try and be disciplined, I'm a sucker for a new plant, so it's always a nice thing to do, as it were. Anyway, the fourth use is kind of a run-on from the third really, but I like to use this tank as a sort of a bit of a testing ground for these new plants. It just gives me somewhere to keep an eye on them and observe them really. And I always find that new tanks are by far the best for doing this, because they're much more nutrient rich, and there's also less sort of really established plants in the tank to give any new things you're trying lots of competition, so they all get a sort of a fair crack at it. So it's a good way of sort of observing things. But when I get a new plant, I really like to get really familiar with the plant and try and observe its growth pattern, just to see what it'll do if I'm going to put it in a future sort of long-term tank. And as strange as it may sound, I actually like to look very closely at the way that the old leaves of plants decay and things like that, simply because the way a plant decays has quite an impact on how tidy the plant is when you put it into a later sort of more permanent tank. Some plants, as you probably know, like cryptocorynes, they tend to just gently melt away, and that's kind of quite a tidy kind of decay really. But on other plants, the old leaves just get really tatty and threadbare, and unless you're constantly removing them, they can look really unsightly. So it's something I like to just sort of observe and keep an eye on, and it enables me to just sort of plan future uses and kind of make the most of things. And sometimes I do actually discard things because I just find them a bit annoying ultimately, even though I like the look of them initially. But also I like to just try and figure out kind of how easy a plant is to actually sustain over a period of time. As you know, if you follow this channel, is that I like really low maintenance things. I don't like plants that I have to constantly keep replanting, as I don't like disturbing the substrate. I really like to just let things run naturally, and a little tank like this, messy as it is, I find is a great way of just observing new things and just seeing how they're getting on. The tank itself is as basic as you can get. It's just a bog standard sort of 24-inch, 60-centimetre tank. It holds, I think, it's about 15 gallons, which I think is about 70 litres, something like that. It's got a really simple little Eheim internal pickup filter in it, just a little internal one. I think it's just the smallest one they make, and even that I've got turned right down onto its lowest setting. The tank is not actually currently heated, mainly because it's just got some Vietnamese white clouds in it, so it's running, literally it's only about 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius at the moment, which basically means that everything grows really slowly, which is kind of handy because it means that I don't have to intervene that often. But if I am quarantining something else, then I have got a spare heater that I just pop in there and sort of crank it up a few degrees before I put fish in. The lighting, again, is very simple. It's just a very simple 7-watt LED strip on for 12 hours today. But I think probably the most interesting thing is probably to run through a little bit of actually some of the plants and things that are actually in this tank. I'll try and point things out. It's going to be a bit tricky being such a jungle, but I'll try and put some arrows and things in the edit, so hopefully it'll give you a bit of an idea. But if you can't actually work out what things are, then you can always Google things and get a better idea that way. Probably if I start fairly randomly, sort of on the left-hand side, sort of towards the left there, there's Cryptocoryne crispatula varbalance, which has always been a real favourite of mine. It's one of the really tall, sort of slender, sort of crinkly cryptocorynes. It's just a really nice cryptocoryne, which I'm trying to find an ideal tank for, and I have been for a long, long while, so always pleased to have a bit of that kicking around somewhere. And then actually, let's do another similar plant, Cryptocorin crispatula var kibote, which is actually a really special plant that I've been after for a very long while. It's going to be very hard to show you, but actually in the middle of the tank, actually towards the back, there's lots of very fine stuff that looks a bit like pygmy chainsword. Well, it's actually a relative of the first plant, and it will actually grow tall and very, very slender. It's quite a special plant. It's taken me a very long while to find this plant. It's quite a rare plant, so I'm quite excited to get it. It's kind of a grass-like cryptocorin, which is very, very unusual, so I'm extremely pleased to have that. And then continue with the cryptocorins. There's a couple of Cryptocorin spiralis, which there's one on the left and one on the right. I'll try and point them out. But they've got these really lovely, slender, undulating leaves with a bit of brown sort of markings down the centre of them. It's potentially quite a good size cryptocorin, which I'm hoping might grow out through the top of other things, but it's potentially a really nice plant, so I'm quite pleased to have that as well. And in the same vein, and you definitely won't be able to see this, I'm afraid, because it's absolutely tiny at the back, is actually the same plant. It's Cryptocorin spiralis, but it's a red clone of it. And all I've got at the moment is a tiny little tissue culture plant, but it literally is a sort of pinkish red leaf. It's absolutely fantastic looking thing. And I'm really hoping that this will grow in my kind of low-tech type of tank. But I really need to have a good thin out once I've done this video, because it obviously needs more light than it's getting at the moment. So that will definitely be a job for once I've done this anyway. And again, more cryptocorins, I'm afraid. Right in the middle, the sort of broadleaf, quite light coloured cryptocorins, Cryptocorin pontidaria folia, which is another kind of old favourite, kind of a good sturdy cryptocorin, but it's got that really nice thick broad leaf and can get quite big. I've had leaves up to about 6 inches across before now, so that's another nice one that I'd like to find a home for. So hopefully once I get these new tanks up and running, you'll actually be able to see some of these plants actually in their true glory in a few months' time anyway. And then on the right hand side, yeah, again another cryptocorin. As you probably guessed, I like cryptocorins. Has Cryptocorin walkeri lutea, which is this really lovely sort of coppery, sort of slightly chocolatey coloured cryptocorin on the right. This is actually a plant that I've had for many, many years. Tropica in Denmark actually used to sell it, which is where mine came from, but unfortunately they don't do it anymore. But it is still available if you search for it. But it's one of those really good, sturdy, very, very easy cryptocorins. So unlike some of the others that can be a bit temperamental, it's a really good one to try, and it makes a great contrast to some of the other ones. And then another one you're going to have a little bit of a job seeing. There's a very small tissue culture, Cryptocorin purpurea, actually in the middle there, which is one that has these kind of dark leaves with very fine sort of striations and things on the leaves. It's a bit of a temperamental cryptocorin, so I don't know how well it'll do long term for me, but again, it's one I'm very pleased to have, and hopefully I'll find a really good spot for it where it can actually do its thing and you can see it properly. And probably the star of the cryptocorins at the moment in this tank is actually the ones at the front here on the left hand side, and these are Cryptocorin green gecko, which is, I kind of would describe it as Cryptocorin wentii on steroids in some ways. It's really just like a normal wentii green, but it has these wonderful splotches of sort of reddish brown in the centres of the leaves. And if I didn't have so much cover and floating planting in here, you'd see they're much more striking than they actually look at the moment. And they will get much brighter under stronger light as well. But it's a really super cryptocorin, and it's a really good sturdy one as well. So it's not the easiest of ones to find, but if you can find it, it's one I would definitely recommend. And then on the kind of right hand side here, this kind of slightly strange sort of bulbous material here is actually a liverwort. It's Monoselenium tenernum, which is I'm not sure if it's technically a plant or not, being a liverwort, but it makes these most wonderful sort of balls that just sort of scatters itself loosely across the bottom of the tank. And a bit like in the 28-year-old tank, cryptocorins and things look wonderful growing up through it. So that's something, again, I'd like to try at another tank at some point. And I'm sure the regular followers also know that I rather like mosses, and tucked in the back of the tank here. I'm afraid, again, it's going to be a bit difficult to spot, but there's actually what they call willow moss, which is actually a British native, although I think it's quite cosmopolitan actually, but it's actually Fontinalis antipyretica rather, get the spelling roughly right. It's actually one of the largest mosses that I know. It has these fantastic feathery fronds, and in actual fact, if the spiky moss doesn't actually stick in the 28-year-old tank, it's one I might actually try in the back wall of that, because I know this will definitely stick to aquarium backings and wooden things. But it's, I think, one of the most ornamental mosses, and you don't see it in aquariums that often actually, so it's definitely another one to look out for, as it were. And then I'm sure quite a few of you have spotted the kind of grass running around the tank, which is just good old Sagittarius subulata, which is one of those plants that I've kind of always got a bit of kicking around somewhere. It's kind of an old favourite, and it'll grow in most tanks, so it's always a good sort of one to fall back on, as it were. And then right in the middle of the tank here, there's actually a very small little tiger lotus bulb. Again, it's a bit like the one in the 28-year-old tank that is always looking really nice. But I spotted this one in a local shop, and it's got really unusual markings. But unfortunately, it's in its kind of dormant bulb stage at the moment, so there's not a great deal to see. But it's one of those things that I just thought was particularly nice, so I grabbed it while I could see it. And then another family of plants, actually, which I've got quite interested in recently, is actually Potamogetans. They're one of the very, very few aquarium plants that are actually like Ambulia. Basically stem plants that you can actually trim without having to constantly replant, and they keep coming back nicely. And there aren't many plants that fit in that category, so I think they've got great potential as aquarium plants, so I like to try them out. And there's actually 3 species in here. On the left hand side here, this is quite a thin sort of spindly plant because it's in the shade, but is actually Potamogeton gayi, which is again a nice sort of plant with a very elegant leaf. And I did actually have this in the 28-year-old tank a little while back, but it actually grew so rampantly that it started to starve out my cryptocoryne, so I ended up removing it. And if I can find it, I'll try and edit in a little picture of that just to show you a little bit more what it looks like. But it was crazy vigorous, but it was really beautiful. And then in a similar vein, there's 3 or 4 stems in the middle of the tank here of what I think is Potamogeton crispus, which is, it's actually a British native that I actually collected from one of my ponds. It was really difficult to actually get it to make the transition from a pond to aquarium growing. I had 3 or 4 attempts and they just kept on rotting, but eventually I got a little piece to root, and you can see it's now actually running across the tank. And it's quite an attractive plant, and it has this rather nice habit of actually laying foliage on the surface of the tank. And I think it's actually able to, again, to take atmospheric CO2 like some other plants can. So it may well get the jump on other things, but it's quite nice in that respect. And I'll try and put a little snapshot of that in the video as well. But it's definitely a plant that I think I might be trying in other tanks. And then this one here on the right hand side again is a Potamogeton, this incredibly fine one towards the top of the tank here. I think it's possibly Potamogeton pusillus, but they're incredibly difficult to actually identify, and I'm certainly no botanist, so I'm not going to attempt to do that. But again, that's another plant that I collected from my ponds, and that one was really, really difficult to get established initially. I've actually made numerous attempts over a long period of time, but this is the first time I've actually got a piece to actually root and start to grow really quite strongly. And although it's a very fine sort of feathery plant, I think actually, as a contrast to other things, it could be rather beautiful in an aquarium. So I'm quite pleased to actually have got it going. And it may actually be the very fine sand that is actually the thing that's enabled me to grow it, because I think it's so fine that it gets damaged or crushed so easily if you've actually trying to push it into gravel or anything like that. So I think that's a definite win for sand when it comes to sort of really delicately rooted little plants. I'll quickly run through a few of the common things that you may know. There's some water lettuce on the top, which you probably know from the 28-year-old tank, Pistia stratoides. There's also a little bit of Indian fern, although it doesn't appear to be doing very well, or water sprite as some people know it as. But this is the original type of water sprite, the one that's been around for many, many years. There's also lots of the good old guppy grass at the back of the tank, the Najas guadalupensis, and also the fairly new Elodia nigas that I picked up a little while ago, which is quite similar to normal Elodia, but again, a little bit more attractive. And I guess no jungle tank would be out without my good old Ambulia, the Limnophila sessiliflora. There's also a little bit of horn water in the tank, I think. And then when we come to actually creatures in the tank, there's quite a bit of sort of clean-up crew, as it were. There's half a dozen good old Amano shrimps, the Caridina multidentata. They, I think, would actually what probably tipped the balance with that horrible air algae for me. Lots of fast-growing plants and good old Amano shrimps. Fantastic for doing that. There's also about half a dozen or so of the green Neocaridina shrimps that I've got in pretty much all of my tanks. Again, just general great clean-up crew. The fish, as you can see, which are pretty chilled at the moment, are just Vietnamese white clouds, just the slightly smaller version of the ordinary white cloud, which I'm hoping again to be able to move into a much bigger tank, hopefully just as a species tank, because they very easily sort of self-perpetuate and they're a really fun fish to kind of do that with. So they actually, when they're in kind of spawning mode, they're really, really pretty little fish. There's also my kind of usual clean-up crew in this tank of a selection of different snails. There's a trumpet snail in here, which I actually scrounged off one of my local fish shops. It's a different type of trumpet snail. It's not one, I don't know what the name of it is, but it's quite different and it's quite a nice snail, as snails go. It depends if you like snails, I guess. But any of you that saw the substrate video I did in this tank a while ago, where the substrate kept going black, between those and the shrimps, they seemed extremely good at clearing whatever that actually was. There's also a little army of good old bladder snails, the Pfizer acuta, and there's also my Bithynia tenticulata snails as well, which is another one that came out of my pond. But one thing I'm really pleased about, a few of you may have seen it, but I did a little video in my very sort of early YouTube days about our native viviparous snails, which are a lovely stripy snail if you're not familiar with them. But in actual fact, there are some baby ones in this tank, which I'm really, really pleased about, because these are quite an unusual snail and they're a live-bearing snail. And this little baby there that I've got a little bit of film of, it was literally born about 4 or 5 millimetres across, which is ginormous for a snail. So I'm quite sort of chuffed to see that, as it were. It's nice to have something new that is sort of self-perpetuating in the tank that is also sort of quite ornamental, as it were. But as you can see, this tank is really just a functional tank that I have multiple uses for, that just sort of ticks along. Whether I'll keep it permanently or not, I'm not really sure. Once I get to set the new tanks up then and start decanting stuff out of the tank, then it may be time for it actually to go, or just literally just keep it as a quarantine tank then. But in the meantime, it's just a fun tank just to keep ticking along. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about my naturally balanced, no water changed, unfertilised aquariums, I'd be eternally grateful if you'd subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.